Thursday of the 13th week in Ordinary Time.
A reading from the book of Genesis. God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son Isaac, your only one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a burnt offering on a height that I will point out to you." Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac and 2 of his servants as well, and with the wood that he had cut for the burnt offering, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar. Then he said to his servants, "Both of you stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go on over yonder. We will worship and then come back to you." Thereupon Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. "Father," he said. "Yes, son," he replied. Isaac continued, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" "Son," Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the sheep for the burnt offering." Then the 2 continued going forward. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. Then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the Lord's messenger called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the messenger. "Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son." As Abraham looked about, he spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the site Yahweh Yireh. Hence people now say, "On the mountain the Lord will see." Again the Lord's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of their enemies, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. All this because you obeyed my command." Abraham then returned to his servants, and they set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham made his home. The word of the Lord.
The responsorial psalm. The response is, "I will walk in the presence of the Lord in the land of the living." Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, because of your kindness, because of your truth. Why should the pagans say, "Where is their God?" I will walk in the presence of the Lord in the land of the living. Our God is in heaven. Whatever he wills, he does. Their idols are silver and gold, the handiwork of men. I will walk in the presence of the Lord in the land of the living. They have mouths but speak not. They have eyes but see not. They have ears but hear not. They have noses but smell not. I will walk in the presence of the Lord in the land of the living. Their makers shall be like them, everyone who trusts in them. The house of Israel trusts in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. I will walk in the presence of the Lord in the land of the living.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After entering a boat, Jesus made the crossing and came into his own town. And there people brought to him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Courage, child, your sins are forgiven." At that some of the scribes said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, "Why do you harbor evil thoughts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He then said to the paralytic, "Rise, pick up your stretcher and go home." He rose and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were struck with awe and glorified God who had given such authority to men. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thursday of the 13th week in Ordinary Time. The first reading comes from Genesis 22, 1b to 19. God puts Abraham to the test. He tells Abraham to go and sacrifice his son, his only son, the one he loves, in the land of Moriah. Now, Isaac is his only son because God has already told Abraham to listen to Sarah and send Ishmael off into the desert, the one he loves. How do we know that Abraham truly loves his son? Because as they climb Mount Moriah, Abraham carries the knife and the fire, while Isaac carries the wood. Now, we might look at that and say, that's a little bit lazy on Abraham's part. He gives the kid the hard work to do. But he is protecting his son, because this is only a young boy. He could easily harm himself with the knife or the fire. Abraham himself carries it to protect him. On the way up, there's a rather pathetic dialogue. Isaac says, "Here we have the wood and the fire, but where's the animal to sacrifice?" Abraham's response, "God will provide." Now, in Hebrew, the tenses are a little bit ambiguous, so it could easily be translated as God has provided, meaning Isaac, the kid who's standing next to him. But what Abraham is already prophesying, without even realizing, is that God will provide. He provides a goat whose horns are caught in a bramble, and that will become the sacrifice. This idea of the substitution of the sacrifice becomes an image that's used for the death of Jesus, that he substitutes for us when he dies on the cross. Why does God test Abraham? God knows everything, but Abraham doesn't. It's through this test that Abraham learns what trust and what faith really mean. A faith that goes beyond trust, a faith of hoping when there is absolutely no reason to hope. God had promised Abraham many descendants. Abraham only has one child. He is the child of the promise, and yet God asks Abraham to sacrifice him. Abraham has to believe that God will bring this to a loving conclusion. He has to trust. Now, there is also a dimension of this story. Some people say that this signifies the end of child sacrifice, and that very well might be true in its original form. But the way this story is told in Genesis, it's clear it's a question of faith and trust. The Gospel is from Matthew 9, 1 to 8. A paralytic is brought to Jesus, and what are Jesus' first words? "Your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the Jewish people who are standing there are scandalized by this, because who can forgive sins? God alone. Now, the irony is, this is a passage of 10 miracles that Jesus is performing to show us that he has the very authority of God. But the very people who were closest to Jesus are the ones who seem to have the least faith. They don't believe that Jesus has the authority to forgive the sins. And so Jesus says, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven or to say walk? What is more difficult? The forgiveness of sins. It's a lot easier to heal a broken leg than a broken heart. Jesus has healed the deepest hurt of this man. He has healed his heart. He has taught this man that he's loved, that his sins are forgiven. Healing his physical condition is much easier, but the people who see it only realize that he has the authority of God when he does that. What is the response of the crowd? Now they're filled with awe. That should have been their response when Jesus forgave the man's sins, but it wasn't. They needed to see, they needed proof. And that shows the lack of faith that they have. Remember how the centurion, whose servant was paralyzed, said, "Your very word is enough. You don't even have to come to my house." In this case, they need to see actions or they won't believe. And so we have to ask ourselves that question. Do we need to see proof? Is our faith so weak that unless Jesus proves himself, and sometimes proves himself every day, unless he does that, we won't trust? And may God bless us.